I want to welcome a very important guest to the show today, Amy B. Chesler. I got to meet her when she interviewed me on her chart topping true crime self help podcast, What Came Next. Um, I had the privilege of being a guest for her and talking about what came next after the trauma, the kidnappings. I mean, we talked a bit about the story as well, but I really love the idea that people only know like my story to the age of like 16. They don't really know what came next. And what came next is just as important as what happened.
I think it's more important, to be honest. I mean, not to interrupt you, but yeah, I think there's more. There are so many more lessons we have to learn from all facets, of course, of our journeys, and that's why we share. But I think the most important lessons for resiliency, for the benefit of society, is what came next and how we got through it. Yeah, sorry, not to cut you.
No, that was perfect. No, I wanted you to jump in. I was just wanting to welcome you and let people know
Thank
that
you.
you are speaking from a place of your own, you know, lived traumatic experience and experiences. And I think a really interesting question is who was the abuser in your experience that we will talk about today?
Yeah, one that's an interesting question because whenever I generally start my story by saying I'm a survivor of domestic violence, but that my mother is not. And the first question I generally get after that is, well, who hurt, your dad? And the answer is no. So the answer to your question is, I think I find it to be one that most people don't expect, but my abuser was my brother, and my mother's abuser was my brother, although she had been in previously abusive relationships before the having my brother and entering the decades of abuse that we would face at his hands.
Wow. So that really is, it just gave me chills and it made me think, okay, we have to remember that it isn't obvious
Mm,
that people who survive such terrible things, it can be by the hands of a sibling. And that is something that we hardly ever look at. And we're going to explore that today.
yeah, and what's really interesting to mention at this moment, considering that idea, because you are absolutely right. But I recently found out in an interview, I was being interviewed about my own story, and they pulled out a statistic I did not know. But one of the most common familial abusive relationships is within the sibling institution. And it is one of, not only is it the most pervasive, but it's one of the least talked about. So there is that really dichotomous relationship between the silent but the presence of the abuse as well. And I think that probably makes it so prevalent too, is that absence of conversation surrounding it.
So, what's interesting about that is that because it's so unspoken, it's often not seen by anybody. So, when you talk about decades of abuse by your brother, domestic violence, or what I had another guest call um, intimate terrorism, and you've called it domestic terrorism before, I've heard you say that. It was with your sibling.
Mm.
And, you know, I want to go back to the beginning of that story, but I also want us to keep in mind that the end of that story was very, very sad for you and for your mother. Can you tell us about the end of that piece of the story? And then we'll go beyond that and who you are today, as this amazing, you know, person who's a public speaker. You are a podcaster. You are, a victim's advocate, all of these things. But I think sometimes people knowing the end of the story will help them want to listen to the rest of the story.
Yeah. Well, and also another really interesting facet of the end of our story too, which only became another beginning,
Right.
which is,
It's
I
not
think, it's a what is it, closing
metaphor.
time, semisonic, I think the quote is. the beginning of one end is always the beginning of it, or the end of one story is always the beginning of another. So,
Right.
unfortunately, on September 25th, 2007, my mom was actually murdered by my brother. And I actually really do prefer to start with that statement because September 25th, 2007, the exact date, not just September 25th, but the year itself as well, became National Murder Victims Remembrance Day. And so I tear up thinking that, but the exact day my mom was murdered, I was joined, but with officially in America started joining all all murder victims together as one to grieve together on that day. It sadly is also National Daughters Day, which is a little bit of a thorn in my side because I feel for all the parents who have lost their daughters, that's a bit of a incongruent feeling. Um, but I like to mention that because I think it it added fuel to my fire in what I do in that speaking career that I have and every passion that I have. I think is the fact that it almost was a sign for me. Like, I don't know what I believe past this life. I'm on the fence about a lot of things, but one thing is I think my mom, it was almost like a symbolism from beyond that joining that community that I saw it kind of like, when I did find out that that was the day that became National Murder Victim Remembrance Day, which I didn't find out until about 2020. So it about took 13 years for that awareness
Wow.
to reach me. Yeah, which is pretty crazy, or maybe 2019, which is speaks to the lack of awareness about these topics, I suppose. Um, yeah, it kind of added fuel to my mission and to my fire and to everything that I want to do with our story because my mom's death and murder cannot be in vain. And we talk about there being a lack of conversation or surrounding things. My mom really did try to utilize a lot of resources in those in those years of abuse. The school system was called upon and they failed us to a certain degree. The medical industry was called upon and that did not serve my brother as well as it should have. And the police were called many, many times. And in Calabasas, California, which is a place of privilege and a very interesting place as the media paints it, which it's not that far off from what the world sees. They lacked a lot of resources that the 90s didn't really offer in general. Um, I think it's taken a lot of conversations like this one and like many of the conversations, representation matters in true crime because true
Yeah.
crime centers around our narratives. So I really appreciate you opening up your platform to me to share all of this. But yeah, that's kind of the result that I'm working with, that I'm taking forward, and also trying to heal generations with my family as well, and for other people.
My heart goes out to you and my hat goes off to you because we kind of have that similar purpose at our core, like to raise awareness and to educate so that people understand, first of all, and they hear our stories, our voices. And to raise your voice is not always, people think, oh, they get all this fame and glory and it's, whatever. And I'm like, uh, it's hard.
Usually it's a lot of
Story.
slack. Oh, yeah, I get a lot more than I mean, I get a lot of support I would never, and I do this for the other victims that say, "Me too," and a lot of women or men or parents reach out and speak about the abuse that they face, um, and that's at the center, but there's a lot of it's hard to dig it up. There's grief in just sharing it, but then also to hear feedback sometimes is really tough too, because sharing ourselves in the media is really hard. It's not an easy process in any way and in any means.
Yeah, it opens you up for criticism and for a lot of like, why didn't you do this? Or how could you be so stupid? Or blah, 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 blah. Like somebody else had all the answers. And if you only would have been smarter, you'd have figured it out. And like you said, you were let down
Yeah.
by every notable system that was supposed to help all of
Well, and I
them. So
think
we,
that's
yes,
yeah, and I think that's a really important thing for us to share. And I know you can sense this in your own story, but we need to share it so people have the tools because when they enter these relationships, we all do in some way on various degrees. this is a spectrum, right? Abuse is a spectrum. It either doesn't happen or it does. And all along the way, there are points in which it can happen. And I think that there are people in all different positions that abuse the power that their positions have. There are all kinds of people or manipulations people use, mechanisms that are still in that spectrum. And I think even when I share about my brother, I might not be helping somebody who is being physically threatened and violently hurt by somebody in their family, but I might be helping a young lady who's in a relationship that can spot the mechanisms of manipulation that we still share, right? So people need to
Yeah,
know that it happens everywhere in all facets. No one's really, immune to abuse. And by sharing, even through that criticism, we're offering people tools and awareness so they can, we can end it, but we can also kind of equip people with awareness and education, and that the first step to change is awareness.
absolutely 100%, 150,000,000%. Awareness is where I think we often find the almost the biggest challenge because people don't want to
Mm.
acknowledge and become aware because they feel like if they hear these stories and they actually are aware, then they have to do something. And
Well,
people oftentimes
yeah,
just don't want to get involved. And I'm sure that that is a portion of even with the people who are supposed to get involved, that
yeah,
they didn't get involved.
100%, and I think that's where the criticism comes in. I don't think people really are trying to be malicious when they criticize victims to a certain degree, unless they're being directly, but when they say, "Oh, why didn't they do this?" I think in their minds, people are offering themselves a buffer from being, treated in the same way because they think, "Oh, well, it couldn't happen to me because that person did this." And it's a distance, and in that distance, there's a comfort. But I think what's interesting about my story specifically, our story specifically, is that it was my brother. It wasn't a relationship I entered and chose to be in, right? Quote, unquote. That's how people
Right.
view these relationships, and when coercion and manipulation and fraud are involved, it's not a choice, it's not true consent. But in people, in the general view, when they don't have that nuanced view, they'll think, "Oh, well, it was her brother. She didn't choose this." Um, and so some people approach my story a little differently than, let's say, an abusive relationship. My mom isn't given that buffer sometimes when people say, "He was 26 living at home, kick him out." Now, I'm a mother. And if my son was going through immense problems, even at the heart of me or with me at the center, I don't think I'd give up and kick him out permanently. She did kick him out sometimes, and she put him in jail sometimes. But there is this kind of, yeah, I think the view and the distance from the issues are that allowing themselves comfort that really just doesn't exist, I think, in this world.
Yeah.
Not to say everybody's bad, but we all have, you know, the capabilities that, especially once we're equipped with this knowledge, we have the power. With great power comes great responsibility. And once we learn these things, we can either kind of help benefit people or hurt people.
Right. And I do really appreciate you saying that because I know that the criticisms that came, to my mom and my dad were especially hard for me because I knew how hard they tried and how much they cared. And also as a mother, also, you know, I can't give up on my child either. I just wouldn't. It's
And we're not
like
professionals here. We're not doctors. We're not
oh,
police officers. We're parents doing the very best thing we can do to show up for our child. And
yep,
that's something that always struck me about your story. And quite honestly, with what came next, there are several people that I just felt like I had to talk to after consuming their stories because as much as the story was beautiful and well told, there was more to it that I hadn't heard. And I could hear in the way you honored your parents through every project you do, in everything that you speak about your parents. That was something that also struck me deeply. That's one of the things I want to do in my life is why I speak out all the time is to honor my mom forever. So that just deeply, I think that was another thing that tied me to your story as well.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think we do have that kind of in common, and I know that you've said, my true calling is really just trauma informing the public, inspiring legal and social change. And those are so exactly like so much of what I want to do in the things that I'm trying to accomplish through my own foundation. And I really appreciate the way that you've done that with your own podcast, like what came next, because people don't often go, like you said, once this ended, well, that is the beginning of the next part of the story. It's the healing part of the story. It's the I'm now becoming an advocate part of the story. It's the what came next that also informs, the public that there's hope and that we can move forward.
Mhm.
But in your case, I think we need to go back to kind of the beginning of that story to help lead people through what actually happened to you and to your mother and how you have now kind of there's not a finish line to healing, but there is an understanding about what happened to us and our trauma. And we know that there is a way to continue to heal and to be able to move forward. And I think that's hopeful and inspiring. And so, would you mind going back to kind of the beginning of how life at home, began and where that young girl, where your memories start?
Yeah. Well, I think a really interesting thing to note is that and I say this as much as I can because I think it speaks to the relationship that my mom and I eventually would have, but she told me that I was the last time my parents had sex. So, that paints a picture of where we got in here and just barely got to the world. Yeah, I mean, like, yes, I was there. No, I mean, it speaks to my mom's openness and what one of the things that carried me through in my healing is that and why I'm open because she gave me the gift of, none of this nothing that you go through is something you have to shove down or hide. But she was super open about that, and I knew my parents were divorced by the time I was born but separated. Again, I was their last hurrah, and thank God they I don't know who precipitated it. I didn't get that deep into the story, but all I know is that I'm here and I'm thankful. However, in that was, my dad, once they were divorced, was no longer in the picture. That was not I found out as an adult once my mom died and I went through her paperwork that he had 50% custody, he just didn't exercise it. So I mentioned that because I think it was very formative for my brother. He, lost my dad or as a presence in his life at the age of 3, and I had a 3-year-old, and at that time, I really thought about how impactful that departure would be, and I think that would be very impactful. We left the family home, we moved back to the Valley, which is where my mom is from, San Fernando Valley, or she's from Israel, but she had grown up here, and, began a journey as like a 3-person family unit. And in that journey, very quickly, um, and I say very quickly, my brother started going through some emotional difficulties. And I would say now, with the information that I have and the view that I have, and this was not a language that anybody was equipped with in the 1980s or 90s, but I would say he had started to exhibit having a conduct disorder very young. And conduct disorders general
I think it's important that you have a degree in psychology. So
Yes, I'm not a doctor and I cannot diagnose it. I can't diagnose him. I can share what his actual diagnoses are. I know he's diagnosed with mental illness. However, I don't believe his many people are like, "Well, that doesn't explain it." I'm like, "I know. I just mentioned them because there are failings in the system." I believe he was not diagnosed correctly. However, at the time, they didn't know what conduct disorder I mean, they did, but that wasn't a largely diagnosed thing. Conduct disorder
and I need you to explain that to our listeners,
yeah,
to tell us what
I would
that
love
means.
to. And that I can speak to generally because I know what it is through my, education and discoveries on my own. I just can't diagnose him because 'cause I'm not a doctor. But, conduct disorders generally, markers are children who just and this is not everybody, but one of the fittings it leads to antisocial behavior. So, one of the really big misgivings about antisocial behavior is that people that are antisocial don't socialize. That's not what antisocial disorder or behavior is. Antisocial people do not fit into general social constructs and norms. So my brother started exhibiting things like a conduct disorder or antisocial behavior very young. He was very sullen and quiet at a young age, and then eventually around 4th grade, he became very angry, um, and uncontrollable in his rage and anger, and that not only was at home, but in the classroom. So he started really, really having a problem with any sort of, what's the word? Authority figure at a very young age. That included my mom, it included teachers, and again, as early as 4th grade.
Wow.
And then it became abusive, when he was in about probably about 7th grade, and I say abusive, and I like to really highlight this portion of our journey because the abuse was not immediately physical harm to our bodies. The abuse began physically to our environment, and I do believe environmental abuse is still physical abuse.
Mhm.
It's that terrorist terroristic kind of approach to wanting to instill terror and fear in us
Yeah.
with his actions, right? That domestic terrorism idea that I thought I mentioned or that you mentioned before, um, but I had said before, because everything he
Specific
did,
examples.
yeah,
Yes.
everything he did, he
Go ahead.
would try to elicit some sort of fear in us. Like I would be standing there talking to him, or my mom would be standing there talking to him, and if an argue ensued, he would punch a hole in the wall right next to where we were standing, as if this is what I could do to you. And so it started there with holes in the wall, and then my mom, I don't police weren't called immediately because again, 7th, 8th grader punching a hole in the wall. I believe the punishment was you have to patch that hole in the wall until before you get screen time anymore or, things like that. And then eventually it evolved into um outright physical abuse, verbal abuse. He swear words, I joked I'm a swearer, but swear words were definitely not something my mom ever did, and I learned my first ones from my brother, I would say. I use them for empowerment, he would use them as weapons. He would verbally assault me quite often. If I had friends over, he would call me dirty words in front of them or tell them I had STDs, like if I ever had a boyfriend over or a guy over. There was no protective older brother action. It would be very, very explicitly abusive. Eventually, my mom actually was handicapped. She for in our journey, it was about a 4-year period where she was bedridden and or wheelchair bound, and in that time, he became very physically abusive to her. He, um he pushed her, he would hit her, um, he also in all of this and I often tell it out of order because I forget this piece or not forget, but I suppose in my journey, I've put it lower on the totem pole of the physical abuse, because I feel so protective over my mother, and I saw such physical abuse towards her, but he also was sexually abusive towards me. Um, I would say I was in 7th grade, he was in 10th grade, which would be his last year in high school. Um, and it took me years to even figure out that he was sexually abusive to me because the definition of these things need to grow. And I needed to realize how abusive he was, but he had been so shrewd in his manipulation that he had blackmailed me to basically perform sexual acts on myself in front of him. So he never touched me. And so in my head,
Yeah.
he didn't abuse me that way. So it took me so many years in learning what coercion and manipulation and assault truly could mean. Um, and I never reported
That's
that to my mom.
interesting. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, we really haven't talked about that I mean, I think maybe one other guest talked a little
Yeah.
bit about something similar, but that's really interesting. I think it's really important that people hear
Yeah.
that it doesn't have to be that he touched you, but just,
Yeah.
demanding that you do certain acts for
Yeah.
him to witness is also sexual abuse.
Yes. It's an abuse, and I think that it helps to define, yeah, I know you have, but abuse is just
Or
using any mechanism of power or control over another person to manipulate a behavior or to coerce them into feeling a certain way, right? So in that, he absolutely abused his power over me, and I don't like to share that. Oh god, I don't like to. It took me I never shared it with my mother. He's never faced any ramification for it. I took it to her grave, and I promised myself I wouldn't take it to mine. I even in my book left out many details because once I wrote it, I went, "Ooh, I gotta take that back." And then I didn't share that fully until I could speak about it, and I realized,
yeah,
no, I people went, "Well, what do you mean by this? He abused you, but didn't ab" I was like, "This is important. People need to realize the nuances of abuse in order to
yeah,
define what they've been through themselves and to make legal change,
yes,
and progress in defining it legally too." It takes people going, "Wait, hold on, this is wrong," to be able to change those things. So,
absolutely. It just
yeah.
takes so much to get legal change because
Oh,
it's so often just, well, he said, she said, and I'm like, no, you can't consent when you're in seventh grade. I'm sorry to any sort of any of that.
no.
It's like,
And
oh, it's
yeah, and even
hard.
so, if he was a child, he still had built up so much of a history that he would have been a youth offender, and it still would have been I mean, that's still so, yeah, I mean, and the abuse that sexual abuse actually started and ended rather quickly. It was within a year, and it was very finite because my mom witnessed him blackmailing me again, and although in that instant, I didn't tell her what he was blackmailing me for, which the sexual abuse ended up being what he would blackmail me. He would not want me obviously, it started small, and then he started growing what I was keeping secret, of course, as abuse goes, and once my mom witnessed him tell me to do one of his chores or something, and she's like, "What?" He did this around his finger when I said no, and she goes, "What was that?" And she caught him, and I told her he had blackmailed me about something stupid. I never told her what it was, and that was the moment it ended any type of abuse directly towards me because it was, I guess, on my mom's radar, I suppose. Um, and then the physical abuse got extremely bad. I would say he left high school. They told him he should leave because he had gotten in a lot of fights. This was obviously not only at home happening, but he was becoming a loose cannon everywhere. Um, and at one point, he made my mom believe he was being picked on and targeted. But now I have the perspective that perhaps he had started a lot of those fights as well. Just knowing his volatility, um, at which he became basically solely our problem, quote unquote. The medical industry at that point was kicking him out of therapist's office because he would yell slurs at them and abuse them verbally. And I guess there was no route around that. They just kicked him out. So he was being, again, dispelled by school, sent away from my therapist. And so the abuse got really bad at that point. I remember in those years just standing in the kitchen, making myself a sandwich, and out of nowhere, I felt a very swift kick between my legs. Full hard contact. I think I bled eventually. I doubled over in pain, and I remember coming up, like, when I got up eventually, I looked up, and it was my brother, of course, and I said, "Why?" Like, as soon as I could speak, I said, "Why? Why would you do that?" And he said, "I just wanted to know if it hurt to kick a woman between her legs." So that was just kind of the environment, and whenever those instances happened, it was generally when my mom wasn't home. Sometimes I would report them, sometimes I wouldn't. Sometimes he'd blackmail me not to. Sometimes as I got older, I would just go to a friend's house or go to work, escape. And as his life kind of devolved, mine evolved, and I went into college, and he went into the military, um, and got kicked out of that as well. Um, or supposedly, yeah, he was in twice. And I never really had confirmation of that until a stranger reached out after my book came out and told me they were in the military with Jesse. And was not shocked to receive confirmation of the murder of my mother. So, it was just a very cyclical, snowballing system of abuse that would have pauses in between if he was in jail or if he was with a friend's father or wherever he was. He tried to go to my dad a couple times and use him as a resource, but my dad was a heavy alcoholic, very emotionally absent. So yeah, it just eventually, the months prior to my mom's murder, were extremely volatile. He was in prison. I'm sorry, not prison. He was in jail. Um, my mom was murdered in September. The last time I can remember him being in jail before was the April of the same year. So what's that? That's 5 months before. I believe he pulled an aerosol can and a lighter on my mom and made a homemade flame torch to attack her and to try to kill her, I suppose. And she called the cops and he was put in jail. But when he was in jail, she would often visit him or, receive calls from him because she wanted him to get on medication and rehabilitate and be a productive member of society. And he would promise her he would. And eventually she'd drop the charges and he would come home. And that was what led him to being home on September 25th, 2007. He was 25 years old and 9 months. He would eventually receive youth offender status for murdering my mom anyway. So in California, I suppose 26 is an adult for murder. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and that began felt like an unending relationship with the legal system at that point.
Wow. So it's so interesting to hear you talk about all the different aspects who all
Which is
basically said, "Not us, we can't handle
Yep,
it. You guys," and there's no it's like somebody who has a health issue, and it seems to me like I have a my best friend, um, since 5th grade. She had a health condition, and it was like nobody was talking to the other doctor, like, there was no quarterback inside of the health industry. She keep
yeah.
doing research and going
Well,
to
and
appointments.
domestic violence is a public health issue. It is,
In
whether it's tied to mental health or the physical health of the victims, or it is absolutely, yeah, and I see a huge shift in the resources that we have now, let alone just the conversation surrounding the things, which is leading to a lot more. But
Yes.
it is eye-opening how many different facets. My mom had her master's in education. It wasn't like she was an uneducated woman in caring for children or even the unteachable children. I just see my
Right.
brother as an unteachable, unmotherable child that a lot of systems failed. It doesn't mean he doesn't have personal responsibility in what he did. That is not what I'm giving him as an excuse. What I'm giving you is a recipe for disaster for my mother's murder.
Right. Yeah, because honestly, and I often say this on my show, and you might agree or disagree with me, but I'm like, even the brain development is not finished till about age 25, 26. It's like you're still in some ways, you're still what I would call a child in some ways. An 18-year-old may have certain rights now, sexual rights or whatever, because now they can give consent, but what happens when they're 16 and it's a 25-year-old? They're not able to. And in your case, with the mental illness, with the conduct problems that you mentioned earlier, how do you put all those pieces together and then take a case, to go, there's something really wrong here.
Yeah,
Somebody's got to do something. It's
yeah,
really unsafe.
yeah.
It was like
Well,
witnessing that in the health industry.
yeah.
My friends, like,
Oh,
couldn't get
absolutely.
everybody talking to everybody, couldn't get the right test because probably they
Yeah.
were too expensive, and it's like, "Man, how
And
do
that
we speak to this?"
Yeah.
Or the worst happens.
Well, and in essence, I think that's also what happened in our case is that, one question that people love to ask is what were his diagnoses or what are his diagnoses? And he still has the same ones. They haven't changed. So, and what I like to highlight is that he was one of the youngest, as far as I know, from what I remember navigating it, is that as a child, but he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder as one of the youngest people in America with it at that time. Like, most people being diagnosed in the 90s were 20, 21, and above. It was not teenagers. So, I think they put a label on him, but didn't know what to do with him because he didn't fit in the category quite right. And I think
Yeah.
it really narrowed the view and how they dealt with him. It was almost like a Band-Aid over the boo-boo, the diagnoses, but also, like, the way he weaponized it and the way he weaponized his behavior in that industry or in that field with his
Yeah.
therapist, and in inpatient treatments, and, my mom definitely tapped into resources, a lot of them, that eventually failed her. I mean, after all that history, he still got into the military, and twice, and went AWOL. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, it's madness if when somebody is smart enough and abusive enough, those 2 things combined can be really dangerous. So, yeah, his diagnosis officially was bipolar disorder, which millions of people live with bipolar disorder in America, and they are not murdering people. This is not I'm not saying I it's an interesting conversation to have when I speak about his mental illness because in no way is it justifying his behavior. It's just how people were justifying his behavior in the 90s as, I
Yeah.
think they were saying he was bipolar disorder, Tourette's, and OCD are his only diagnoses. Um, and I do
And yet
believe yeah, I think those are doctors that didn't really have a good view of him. I think I've had a 38-year view of him, and I believe he is, uh yeah, he definitely has antisocial personality disorder. Um,
definitely.
and there's a lot more to even still be understood by about all of it, but, and the nuance of people who have mental health diagnoses and also commit violent crimes.
Yes, and I think that that's the basis, that particular, you know, like you said, is my diagnosis of him, he had this. That's kind of the basis of sociopathic behavior, which where there's not the emotional connection
Yeah.
to the I mean, these were his, family members, and there's not the connection to them that would stop a person from, and I often say, how do people abuse, their children? And then I'm like, now I'm going to say, how do children abuse
Yeah.
their parents?
And it's shocking
Parent.
because I really do receive so many messages, especially from women. I think it's the dynamic, especially for single mothers and sons, but it's not only women. I think also women feel like safer coming to me specifically, and that's probably why I receive more women, but because I know men are victims too. But um absolutely, I receive so many messages from parents saying, I thank you for being aware. I mean, for being open with your journey so I can be aware of what is potentially a possibility because I've already started down this road. The police have been called to my home umpteen times. That I have been threatened in similar ways as your mother. I never thought that this could happen. I am so glad I stumbled on your story. And that is I one of my goals is to make my mom's death not in vain. That would be
Yeah.
the most heartbreaking thing in the world if nothing good came from this. My mom was an idiom lover. She loved silly statements and like the what is that, Poor Richard's Almanac. But one of her favorite statements was something good comes out of everything. And
Yeah.
I don't think there was any good in her murder or the abuse we faced before or the abuse I faced after. However, if I can turn our heartache into something positive for other people, that is that good. Helping is
Yes, and
healing.
that's
You know that.
absolutely, very much so the reason that I knew I wanted to tell my story, because I was like, people don't get it that the person that's grooming you and that's manipulating you and your family members is a close friend or a family member, or someone that you're supposed to trust in your school or your clergy, or it's like it's not scary strangers.
Yeah.
That hardly ever happens, and
Well,
nobody was talking about that.
and people don't even realize that part of grooming is the trust. They need trust to groom someone, so they're going to and this is I just yeah, it's mind-blowing too. And when we talk about all facets of abuse, I think that's why there are good people in every field. There are good people who are drawn to be police officers because they want to help. There are good
Mhm.
people drawn to be a teacher because they want to help. And then there are bad people who see the power inherent in positions in churches, in classrooms, in police officer, in that uniform, in order to use that power to abuse and groom and use a distrust. And a lot of those positions that I mentioned, when we think about it, there aren't those are positions that have built-in trust, but a lot of them don't. So you're looking at family members, like, people that work at the grocery store, no there's nothing wrong with that, but there's no inherent trust. I'm not gonna go tell them my deep, dark secrets. So
Right.
but they people that I might see and build a relationship with over the years, and there's just so many mechanisms in the abuse that when we talk about it in all facets, whether it is someone that we know from the grocery store or someone in our home, we have to share these things because there is no typical picture of the perpetrator, but there is a typical picture of the behavior they use to perpetrate these crimes.
Yes, and that's why that's one of our main goals in, we're starting, we've talked about grooming and manipulation and being conned and duped and all of these things for, a lot already, but now we're gonna, like, focus, just laser focus on grooming and manipulation
Mhm.
tactics so that hopefully people can start to see through it
Yeah,
sooner before the worst happens.
yeah.
So this is very personal. Were you there when your mother was killed? Were you in the home?
No, I was not. I my family knew I would be gone that evening. I had work pretty late that evening, and they both had been notified of that. They had both called and checked on me, and during the day, I'd received a few kind of not frantic, but I could tell there was some sort of escalating. My mom knew I was at work, so she wasn't like, "Hey, we're fighting, come home." She was kind of like, "Are you coming home soon?" And then my brother would call and say, "Are you coming home soon?" And so these kind of back-to-back phone calls, I knew something was happening, but that wasn't rare, right? And I had work pretty late, so on the way home from work, I called my brother to ask him if, he wanted to watch a TV show with me that night, that we had just gotten on DVD because 2007.
Well,
And I called him back and I said, "Hey, yeah, I'm done with work. You wanna watch Quantum Leap still?" And he just said, "No," and he told me not to go home. And at that point, I was like, "Why? That's weird." And he said, "Just don't go home," and he hung up. And so I called home, and my mom was a teacher, did not have a life out of myself and my brother. Like, that's just the reality. She was always either at school or at home, and at home, she might be waiting for me to come home or she's on the phone with a friend, but that was it. And so the fact that she did not pick up the phone was weird to me, so I called my brother back and I said, "Why wouldn't I go home?" And he told me he had killed her. Um, at that time, he said, "I killed mom." And I said, "Yeah, bleeping right. What are you talking about?" And he said, "No," and he repeated himself and then he hung up. And I called home again and she did not pick up. So I called him again and his phone was off. He had turned it off. And so at that point I chose to call 911 because I, considering our history and quite literally how many times I think the police had been called to my home 10 to 15 times in my youth. So I'm thinking this is not a rarity. I was thinking if I'm calling and it's a joke, will I be up for charges for the like, I was just contemplating everything and I thought, it doesn't matter, just call. But I got home before the 911 and before the responders came. I entered the home and I found her. And it was kind of like a movie. I Not the finding her, although I see it as clearly as a movie in my head, but just I don't know if you want me to be a little bit more descriptive in that sense. I don't mind because think it speaks to my brother's just horrific behavior.
yeah, I would if
Okay.
you feel comfortable doing
Yeah.
Amy, I'm so sorry.
Um, I mean, I didn't at one point, but now I've done it enough where I do. But yeah, no. I walked in, and my mom was kind of like the ultimate hostess. She loved to cook. She loved to have people over, and so to find her in the kitchen was the worst probably place I could have. But she was in the kitchen. And I could see that he had used a kitchen knife to kill her. And she was laying in a very large pool of blood. The knife was sticking out of her neck still. Um,
Oh, Amy.
and I saw the phone was just out of her reach. I obviously started screaming. I don't remember that, but I've heard the 911 call since after being on Evil Lives Here. They played it for me, which was a bit of a jarring experience, but I can still hear myself screaming from that at least. And um, I was beside myself. I didn't know if she was still hanging on by a thread or something. So I hugged her. Like, the only spot on her body that didn't have any blood was her leg. I hugged her leg, and at that moment, I kind of heard the person in my ear, I'm still on 911, say, "The killer might be inside." And I went, "Oh, shit." And I ran out, and basically right when I ran out, the police drove up, and that began the hunt and for him and the legal procedures.
And you said there was first of all, can we just acknowledge that, you've been through some extreme trauma? Um, PTSD, CPTSD, these are the kinds of things that result from a trauma like that and a visual, trauma of your mother, um, being there. I just want to acknowledge your bravery and your the rest of your story and how it speaks to what an amazing person you are to have, lost your mother in this way, to have been, through so much abuse from your brother in so many different ways, and just to stand up for, um, as you speak, to people about parenthood and about grief and about domestic violence and the nature of abuse and trauma, and then also trauma healing. I mean, you're really an inspiration to me, and now that,
Thank
not only are you an author, where you've written your story, but what you were talking about a minute ago was was it a television show that
Mhm.
that featured your story?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Evil Lives Here, IDTV, yeah. Which
Okay. So that's somewhere that people could find your story if they'd like to watch
yeah,
even.
there have been some major progressions since the show, but it just came out not long ago, surprisingly. But season 11, episode 2, it's called What If He Gets Out? Which is
Okay.
alludes to the next first portion of our journey. But
Yeah, and we
yeah,
talk a little bit about the next portion, but it's IDTV.
yeah,
Okay.
investigation, discovery, television, Evil Lives Here, season 11, episode 2. Yeah, just to carry us forward a little bit more, Jesse was caught, that night. It took a few hours. Um, I think what gets lost in all of the sharing and all of what we have to talk about is my mom's spirit and how she was my absolute best friend. Um, and I like to carry the rest of the conversation because I think it speaks more to her. Um,
Yes.
but that night, immediately, the droves of people just started coming out. I thought I didn't remember who I had called to tell them what had happened. I remember calling very few people. It turns out most of them found out from the news, but people were coming out of the woodwork, waiting with me to wait it out and make sure he was caught. You know, 2 houses down, my mom's best friend from middle school lived there, so he opened up his home to us, and we all just kinda sat and waited. It was, my mom's best friend from middle school, my ex-boyfriend uh, who had a better relationship with my mom. He used to climb into bed with her and spoon her and surprise her and say, "Hey, Hadass, I came to see you, not Amy." Um, they just people the community really came through, and that's something that carried me through my entire journey and still does, and that's why I came.
Right, how old were you
I was 22,
that day?
22.
22. Okay.
I was 22, my mom was 55, and when I lost my dad, I was 33 and he was 66. So the double numbers, I don't like them, but, But
Wow.
yeah, I graduated college like a week before. Talk about youth status. I was a kid. I was not ready for adulthood. But I got thrown into, Jesse was caught. We kind of all assumed everything. All those people that were there kind of like let out a gasp, like, okay, good. And none of us really knew what was in store. I think we all thought like, "Oh, good, he's in prison, he's in jail, he's gone forever." And that is not what happened. Thankfully, no one bailed him out. God, I never really thought about that prospect, but he was in jail for years before he would be convicted, even though he had had decades of abuse documented before. He clearly did it. He just basically played the system over those 4 years, he would do many things. He would represent himself, he would hire his lawyer, fire his lawyer, he would get on medication, get off medication, so he was fit to stand trial or not to stand trial. He tried to plead, um, uh, it's not insanity, but it's, what is it?
Mental defect.
Diminished
Yeah.
capacity. Yeah, and what did him in on that was the fact that he told me not to go home. Those words actually proved that he knew he had done something wrong and that he was trying to protect me from something. So he couldn't plead that. But all of these things were things that kind of like extended the time. So it took the last thing he tried to do before the 4 years were up was hire a hitman to kill me from within jail. He wrote a whole detailed letter out to an inmate, which I actually got to see when I filmed Evil Lives Here. They obtained it from the detective. I had never seen it before. They had just flashed it to me and said, "Is this your brother's writing? Did you have anything to do with your mom's murder?" He tried to pin the murder on me 4 years in. And then if I didn't accept those terms, have me killed by that inmate. Thankfully, the inmate turned in the letter. It was insane. Then right after that incident, he pled guilty. He took a plea deal. Um, he got 15 to life for second-degree murder. We then at 13 and a half years, I got a notification saying he was up for parole. And mind you, at the 13 and a half year mark,
Gonna ask.
well, I was gonna say at the 13 and a half year mark, that was only 9 years from the death threat. So, it had taken 4 years to convict him, and then 9 and a half years later, I was getting a notification about his parole hearing, um, which is shocking and gutting and all the things. So the system is I like to bring awareness to the system as well because it does not serve us, often unless we are super diligent. And finally, I received an ultimate swift serving of justice just this year, actually. When I found out my brother was up for additional charges, he created a mace. I don't know if you know what a mace is. It's a metal ball with spikes on it on a chain and he
Mm.
attacked a public officer. It's like a medieval weapon. He built one in prison. Attacked an officer, got a attempted murder charge, and the week of that murder charge sentencing, I found out about it. I didn't even know. And I told the DA about something I forgot to mention, which actually Evil Lives Here was gracious enough to let me film an update, but at his first parole hearing, he threatened my life and my children's life and recited a recent address of ours. And when I tried to report him for that, the prison system said, "Sorry, it wasn't a big enough threat." Um, yeah, so I
What
was
is a
brand
big enough threat?
yeah. Well, because his
What?
wording was very careful. He was like, "I could have a friend come visit you," and, like, basically a friend from jail, and then he said something else that was, like, pretty brazen right after that. Also before saying he was going to kill someone in the prison he was in if they didn't move him. Then they didn't move him, and he attempted to kill an officer. So, I happened to get a hold of that DA the week of his new charges, and he charged him for the death threat as well, and he gave my mom retroactive justice. They took away his youth offender status, and he received 36 more years, another life sentence. Yeah, and 2 more strikes, and in the California prison system, 3 strikes and you're out. He only got 1 strike for my mom's murder, and he got 2. one for the attempted murder, one for the death threat of against myself and my children. They when I gave my victim impact statement, before I gave it, they were gonna give me a 30-day protective order, and then I gave my statement, and the the judge said, "You know, I think I'm gonna change that to a 10-year." So, yeah, I know, and I like to share all these things because when a DA
Yeah.
cares to help you, and when a DA cares to go after him for another charge, and when a judge cares to give you extra protection, you can get it. And I didn't know any of these. I That day I was like, "I don't want a protective order. What is it gonna do? You can't protect me." And they said, "No, no, no, no."
What you don't know.
Yeah, it makes it a crime the moment he contacts you, the moment he sends someone else to contact you on his behalf. These are things I didn't know until someone educated me. So, um,
And they educated you with this one word that you used for all of those people because they cared enough to educate you,
well, yeah.
because you don't even know the questions to ask. You wouldn't
Yep.
even ask the question
Yep.
because you don't know what you don't know.
Mm.
And that's why a caring DA, a caring, judge,
Well,
somebody that actually cares.
the thing is about I like to draw attention to the system, is that it's not really a
Yes.
system. It's not a system if there's no systematic approach to every single person or victim they're receiving. It is
Right.
why a lot of
Not checks and balances.
oh, yeah.
It has to go this way.
Well,
Not at all.
if the system if in the
Girl.
system there's so much discretion to the DA to care to do the trial. I mean, I was just speaking to someone earlier today who was stalked, a horrific experience. I can't even begin. But basically, all of the system basically negated her every time they had a chance and never even took a police report. When in the end, this man is being civilly and criminally charged. So they could have at that point. If another county can see and have that discretion to charge a person for the same crime that the other one doesn't, that's not a system. When a judge can make like a call and give more justice. I One of my guests somewhat came next once said, when I can enter with the same case into 5 different courthouses and come out with 5 different outcomes, there's a problem. I'm like, that's
That's
not a
not a system.
system. It's not a system.
Right.
So, I
Yep.
definitely it took me 16 years to find a DA that cared to just stick it out, and he was like, "I'm not gonna give this man a plea deal. I am going to make him take this, like, this is going to happen, Amy. I will not give up on you." And I told him, like, "It took me 16 years to find someone like you in the system. I didn't even know you existed. I didn't know this was possible." Yeah.
Just that's such an awareness that we need to hear so much more about, because definitely, the third pillar of my foundation is to instigate legal change. That
Yeah.
public policy is changed so that it favors the victim instead of the perpetrator. Like, there should be speaking between all these, like you said, it shouldn't take
Yeah.
five different, you know, l legal systems inside of different counties that can all give a different outcome to the same crime.
Yeah.
That's not a system. I just love how you said that. That is a problem.
Yeah.
That is a huge awareness that is not present. I just knew that the legal system failed us because my parents didn't know what questions to even ask. They'd never been in a courtroom. They
Yeah.
barely had a parking ticket. They didn't know, "Oh, don't go talk to his attorney." "Well, why
Yep.
not?" She said, we can figure this out and it'll go away so that your daughter doesn't have to go through any more, harm." And
100%. Well, and
they
something
don't know that,
yeah.
know.
And something is really interesting that I found out about domestic violence courts is that even officers that show up to reports, so for my mom's safety, right? I've heard from other victims that for police officers have come to take a report, they take the report and the woman decides to drop it. And then the police officer has the discretion to say, "No, this is abuse. I am trained enough to see this, or I believe this is abuse. No matter what you're saying, I can still press charges on the behalf of the state or whatever it is, right?" That's possible. So
Yes.
even that raises the question, well, where was that person? Anybody doing that for us? And I understand it's different and nuanced because it's a mother and a son. and we didn't have that understanding. Well, now I'm calling it out and saying, okay, more clarity, more charges. Police need what that story boils or that incident boils down to is that there's so much discretion in the officer taking that report too. They can make that
Yeah.
report whether you want to drop it or not. And I don't know if that's true in every state, obviously. That's probably location to location. But still, that there just needs to be way more training in domestic violence awareness, in so many things. What were you gonna say? I'm sorry.
And trauma informed, just being
100%.
trauma informed. It has to be a 100% every
Yes.
social worker, police officer, anybody who is
Yeah.
interfacing between, victims and abuse and crime, that has to be, like, so understood
Yeah.
because you show up at a door, and what if the abuser answers the door and
Yeah.
has every excuse, and, "Oh, my kids, they have such an overactive
Yep.
imagination, and this is what happened. I told them they were gonna get a spanking and blah, blah," whatever it is, they've already termed the person at the door,
Yep.
and so the people walk away, and then you have a Jesse Dugard that's had 2
Yep.
however many children in the backyard from a tent who's been kidnapped, years before,
Yeah.
I mean, and that's an extreme example because the much more common examples are just their own children, or
Yeah.
their spouse that is being, silenced and
Yep.
abused, and now the abuse just gets worse because they
Yep.
walk away, and
Yeah.
I am like, if we could just leave one message for people, it is that, yeah, most of the time, it's not because you aren't bringing charges against the person. The state has to do that. The community,
Systems
the
have to
county.
have our back. Yeah.
Exactly. They are the ones that do that. It's
Well,
not like
even the professionals in this space, the mental health police. Yeah. I had a really interesting interview recently with that will be impending. It hasn't come out yet, but had the beautiful chance of interviewing Vermont, the state of Vermont's first female commissioner of public health. So her job is to oversee all forces of public health. That's police, that's firemen, that's the people inspecting the elevators. Like her job is massive. And
yeah.
we were talking about the intersection of public health and public safety and true crime. And just as a genre, right? And we're saying in the vein of what we're talking about right now and the systems coming forward and everything, she even said, and she was very open about, like, what she would hope, like, police can offer more, right? She wants all of
Right.
these intersections to happen. However, even in the media, there is space for what we're doing in not even only space, but this is what should be paramount is giving the equipping people with the education, the awareness. That's improving public health and safety, right? Giving a
That
really salacious title and giving some gruesome details and then moving on is almost the opposite of fostering public safety and health. So all of
right.
these things that kind of surround true crime are lives, representation, awareness, education, the media, the legal system. All of those things need to be just way more cohesive and supportive of each other in order for this to actually be a space for healing instead of just divulging some shit and moving on.
Ugh, absolutely.
I
I can totally see why you've been given so many honors in the space of raising your voice, writing your story, having it be, one of those that you can access in a media world, and then even going farther, blog her honor of Voice of the Year. Tell me about that because
You're
you
so
were
sweet.
given that honor. And what blog her honor of Voice of the Year in 2017. That was, like, kind of the beginning of where I see your accolades starting to come, and again, this happened back when you were 22, and so
Yep.
what is the rest of your story, which is now, what you're saying, what came next is your podcast, what came next, and all of this is what came next for you,
Yeah.
to MC, that Popular Moms Meet conference in 2018 and 19, and then, to move forward into 2021, and you released now your true crime memoir, and working for justice. And that I'd like to hear about the books,
Yeah.
the things that you're working on and you have been working on that have been released and that are upcoming.
Uh,
And of course, now I've told everybody about your true crime, podcast, what came next. But you're working on all kinds of things, all sorts of efforts, and I just admire everything that
Oh
you do to
gosh.
bring the education and awareness. Tell us what's going on right now.
Lord, I am
With
all over the place. So yeah, I think it's interesting
and
that
her mom.
yeah, well, I was gonna say, I was actually gonna start this answer in a similar way, something I answered or I asked you. And I remember one of the things that I really loved learning was that Austin works with you. And
Mhm.
one of the things that really led you down your path of sharing was when it hit you that you had some healing to do for your family, right? And I was a teacher. I taught English. That's something I don't really talk about much, or I taught a lot of things. I was a homeschool teacher, English teacher, whatever. And when I had my own kids, I realized that there was a lot of shit that I had to divulge and uncover and work through to be the healthiest parent I
Yep.
could be. And in that, I refound writing. I'd always been a writer by nature. I think I'd always had a lot of teachers that reinforced that in me, and so I started writing. I started a blog. I started writing for Chicken Soup for the Soul. I think I have like 7 stories with Chicken Soup for the Soul. But something that really struck me with that start was Amy Newmark, who is the editor in chief of Chicken Soup for the Soul now. She was like, "I have read so many of your stories, and I never knew at the center of it was so much trauma." And I didn't, because I wasn't ready to divulge the true crime portion of my story yet. I was getting through the grief, like you said, the parenting portions, the deep throes of young parenting. And so I was just kind of like going through the feelings portion of it first. And then once I got through that and I was able to start consuming true crime again, because I kind of always had been a fan of true crime content. And my mom had too. And that's kind of like some people ask me, like, "Do you think your mom would mind being a book and, like, being in," and I'm like, "No. This would this is she was a teacher, she would want people to learn from her experiences."
Right.
So I
It's
think it's
amazing.
all of those spaces. I actually had to leave a marriage for me to be able to be in this space too, and to empower
Yep.
myself, fully, and to be able to share my story fully. And so now, after having grieved and having entered a groove in parenting and entering a groove in writing and freeing myself of some binds in previous relationships, I'm definitely stepping into an era of honoring myself. And in that,
Yes.
lots of different projects. Hopefully my podcast can continue for as long as possible. I have another book that I'm pitching. Um, I don't think it's going to end up being titled Working for Joy, but that's the idea. My first one was Working for Justice. Now, at this end of the 16-year battle, I feel like I have it finally to a certain, as much as I can get it, with him staying in prison. So now I'm just working on the narratives and what I have to share surrounding finding joy after trauma, right? Part of that is
Why that yeah.
yeah, and
Allie
so
just went to retreat, and that's what it was called,
yeah.
exchanging pain for joy.
Oh, I
Exchanging
love
for
that.
joy.
Yeah, and
Stuff
it's
in exchange.
yeah, and I didn't always wanna be a true crime writer, so I'm stepping into my next memoir with more of an erotic side because that's honoring that side of what I do. I go off and,
Yeah.
after my divorce, I heal a lot relationally that I had residually from my trauma. So I kind of that's what I'm gonna do in that book, and then I'm also wrote a rom-com movie and, like, have so many things going on. I'm trying to think of, like, anything super relevant. I mean, I'm always just so blown away by what who I get to meet because of what came next, and whether that show
Yeah.
persists forever or not. I know it will lead to other really wonderful things in this space because I think I've I've been gifted a beautiful thank you by you, by other podcasters, by TV articles, just being given the voice is beautiful. And I know a lot of people say I like to give other people will say, "I like to give voice to the voiceless." I don't think I'm doing that. I can't take that on. I can't speak for anyone else but myself and my mother. I feel like I can speak for my mom because I knew her well enough. Um, and I know I, like, carry on her memory, but, I think by speaking just for the 2 of us, I do that awareness that I'm bringing for other people to know that they're not alone. I know I'm lightening that load because when I shared with you and you shared with me, that lightened my load, and I'm sure you feel that to a certain degree. And even that in sharing, whether we're equipping people with knowledge or changing things or not, at least we're just sharing. And sharing, if you can imagine baggage, like people like to equate our trauma as baggage. If you think about it that way, well, I got a lot of baggage, but I carry it well. And I share it.
I've got Louis Vuitton
Yeah,
somewhere in my bag.
and I like to say
Went how that
mine
carry it with class.
I love it. Mine's all my my mom was a collector of Dooney& and Bourke, so I'd like to say mine's all my mom's collected Dooney& and Bourke, vintage Dooney& and Bourke, but whatever it is, it's not about what the brand, it's about how you carry it, right? And I think that even if nothing else, just giving people hope, like, life exists after trauma. Like, people we go through
Yes.
shit, um, a spectrum of it, and it's not comparative, it's not comparable to each other, but when we share it, we can get through it.
Yes. Oh, I love that. That's such a beautiful way to kind of sum up who you are. I mean, your lived experience has included about every single aspect of pretty much anybody that I know, the criminal justice system and the failures that we have to try to remedy, or at least by talking about it, I believe that change does happen and that we're not alone and that there is hope after trauma, and that you've lived through, every kind of really abuse or violence, when I say that our mission statement is to end, make the world a better place by ending sexual violence against children. I mean, pretty much anybody, to me, 25 years of age and younger, you're still in those developing years with your brain and your emotional body and your sexual body and your all the things that you're trying to become. And when they're so interrupted by abuse, we really do have to at least be there for each other in a world of understanding, of
Yeah.
listening.
And I think also
That's
speak to that.
what we're doing.
And yeah, and to speak to that too, I'm sorry to cut you off again, but to speak to that, I think that we as victims have no greater responsibility and no other responsibility either than to heal ourselves. I don't think we need to forgive anyone. I don't believe in I have no forgiveness to give my brother. I don't hate him.
Yep.
I tell my children, like, my children know now about my life, and they ask me, "Do you hate them? Do you wish?" No, I don't. That is too much energy to expend to the situation that I have expended or extend way too much energy to already, like, years of my
Let
life.
that go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I don't owe him anything, I don't owe him forgiveness, I don't even need to give it to him for me. What I do owe myself is healing. I'm obviously, life happens, right? Some of it is very traumatic, and some of it is mildly traumatic, and some of it is wonderful. And all across the board, what we just need to do is the greatest responsibility I carry is only healing myself and healing myself for my kids mostly, but also for myself, of course. So, yeah, I also
Yes.
when I
Well, because that has a ripple effect both ways,
yeah,
you know?
yeah,
It there is something about taking care of our own healing that truly does the domino effect both directions
yeah,
almost. I don't know how that works. I'm a
spiritual healing.
cautionary spiritual person. I'm very cautious because I want to make sure I'm never brainwashed again.
Yep.
So I'm a cautiously spiritual person. But I do know that there is something in that does transfer or move the energy
Um,
around.
well, I don't know if you can see my
I don't know.
tattoo. My most recent tattoo, it says Tikkun Olam, which is the Jewish tenet or the ideology that the only responsibility we have in each of our lives is when we make it a better place with our birth. We just whatever we do in our lives, we don't, to heal our own path, whatever it is, we're just making the world a better place. And I think in all of that, you're just making the world a better, I mean, like, retroactively for all of it.
Yeah,
I really do think
all of it.
I saw that with my mom's journey by my being diligent and tenacious with the legal system. She received retroactive justice. I literally made it better going backward. So, yeah, you just can't anticipate that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you a million times over for being so open, so honest, so vulnerable, and just sharing who not only who you are, but who your mother also was and how that has impacted all of our lives. that your lived experience and your sharing of it has impacted so many lives, even though you say it's just, I'm only I can't I can't fix everybody else, but I can work on me. And in doing that, you have made a great impact and had a great deal of influence. And
Thank
and
you.
we don't feel alone because of Amy Chesler. We're not alone.
You're so
Would you mind just well, I mean it. I really am so deeply grateful that we had this conversation and that you asked to interview me and that I feel as if you're a friend, and certainly in our desires to basically, be the difference or the change that we want to see in the world. I thank you for that. Could you just once again say what your tattoo says to
yeah.
end our podcast one more time?
It's Tikkun Olam, and so it's Tikkun Olam, and, like, if it's a different language, so it's hard with the transliteration, but if you Google Tikkun and then the second word Olam, yeah, it's just basically, like, we each have a equal responsibility in healing the world, and our own birth can make the world a better place. That's what we
Oh my
yeah.
gosh, it just makes me cry. I think that's so beautiful. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that. It has definitely made your birth has made my world a better place.
I'm so glad my parents did it that last time. No, I'm just kidding.
Thank you. Me too. I'm so glad too. I mean, that's the one thing that every child wants to think about is like their parents doing it that one last time.
I don't mind. My mom was yeah. Oh, no, I love it. Thank you.
Oh, but
Honestly, I will cherish this conversation and any conversation I have with you always because it always I hope this doesn't make you feel weird, but, I can remember maybe a year ago sitting down maybe over just sitting down and watching your documentary, then watching the dramatizer and just going, "This woman is something else. She is a powerhouse." And just having it in my mind that I had questions for you. I wanted to know more. I wanted to find out more about who you were, and you being open to doing that with me, it was just mind-blowing. So to be sitting here on the other end, you know, however many months later, it just makes me it's like the full circle moment that yeah,
yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I feel the same. This has been amazing. And thank you for being here on the show today. I know that this has influenced and helped some other lives out there that are listening. So thank you, Amy.
My pleasure.